Welcome to all those that are joining us for day two of Bridging Silos. So I'm going to get started. I just want to welcome back all those who were with us yesterday, and welcome to all of you who are joining us for the first time today. My name is Jayme Jones, and I'm a researcher with the Columbia Basin Rural Development Institute at Selkirk College, one of the organizers, and I'm one of the organizers of this event. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the land on which Selkirk College operates here in the West Kootenay region, where I call home. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Snakes, Silks, Ktunaxa, and Secwepemc peoples. And I invite all of you to just take a moment and reflect on the land for which you call home and acknowledge those traditional territories. We're gathering here today to learn about advancing climate adaptation and low carbon resilience in small communities and rural regions. This event is hosted by us, the Columbia Basin Rural Development Institute at Selkirk College, in partnership with the Adapting to Climate Change team at Simon Fraser University and the Planning Institute of British Columbia's Kootenay Rockies chapter. And we're able to gather here thanks to the funding of the Municipalities for Climate Innovation program delivered through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and funded by the Government of Canada. As we were developing the idea of this event, we built the bold vision to center it around building and strengthening relationships, as well as learning from each other and experts. And this is a bold vision considering we're in a virtual space. However, the platform we chose and the way we designed our agenda was really to try to strengthen those relationships between each of you as our attendees. As we know, climate change is a complex issue, and it's not something we can address alone in our various silos. We need to work together, and that's how we came up with our conference theme of Bridging Silos. It's through these strong foundations of these relationships that we can build the bridge across the silos that do exist. And it's through these relationships we're given the gift to learn from each other, learn what's working well or different challenges that might exist. And it also allows us to build that shared context to learn from experts and apply it to our unique context in our small communities and rural regions. Yesterday, we had many opportunities to listen to each other, to learn, to make those connections to help us break down silos, bridge silos, and advance the climate adaptation and low carbon resilience in our communities. Through these engaging sessions, we heard many different voices from a wide variety of backgrounds on topics including climate data, food resiliency, natural assets, climate resilient homes and buildings, co-benefits for healthy communities, and best practices from local government policy and planning. And today we have another excellent schedule planned with a bunch of really engaging sessions. So we hope you enjoy it. We also really encourage you to take advantage of the networking opportunities and the different ways you can connect with your fellow attendees. And you can do this by using the networking tab on the platform. And we're also going to be hosting an open space session. And this is an opportunity for you to have those conversations that are of interest to you with those you'd like to speak with. And yesterday we did it through our platform. And unfortunately, as we're learning and innovating and trying these different ideas, we learned that the platform just didn't quite work the way we were hoping it would for these sessions. And so we're going to do it differently today. We are going to use the platform Wonder, which is what we used to host our Bridging Silos virtual lounge last night. And it's a really fun platform where we can move around. And we've built in some themes for you within that platform to possibly spark imagination around different conversations within those themes. But you're welcome to host any conversation that inspires you within that space. So we really encourage everyone to join. It's really simple. So join us for the open space session later today. And just to wrap up my comments as I welcome each of you before we lead into our speakers, I want to reiterate what one of our plenary speakers said yesterday. We have to go far together versus fast alone. So thank you, Sangeeta, for that wonderful quote from the plenary yesterday. So, and thank you for each of you for being here, because together through these conversations, we can go far together towards advancing climate adaptation and low carbon resilience in our communities. And now I'm very thrilled to introduce our next speaker and share welcome remarks. I'd like to welcome the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Strategy for the province of BC, Minister George Heyman. George has been the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Strategy since 2017. Before being an MLA, he was Executive Director of the Sierra Club of BC. He's been a faculty member of Simon Fraser University's Dialogue and Negotiating Program and has served as the board member of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. George is dedicated to advocating for the people and the environment against climate change. Welcome, Minister Heyman.
Thank you so much, Jayme. And I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. It's a real honor for me to have an opportunity to begin this day of the conference with some remarks and try to talk a little bit about what we're trying to do in our government policy about climate generally and climate adaptation. One of the things I've learned in my consultations and my discussions and my the information briefings I get around climate is that the issues for small, rural, and Indigenous communities are very heightened. They're critical, and I think it's fair to say for Indigenous communities, the relationship with the land, and both for culture, historical reasons, spiritual values, and sustenance are far deeper than we experience in an urban environment. So while climate change affects us all, I think the focus that is being placed on small and rural communities and Indigenous peoples is especially germane to discussions that we all have to have. In order to address climate change, as a government, we need to work across all sectors. We need to engage people from small communities. We particularly need to ensure that we live up to our own legislation and our own beliefs, that we're respecting the rights of Indigenous people, the historic relationship of Indigenous people to the lands that most of us have come to far more recently, as well as the cultural and Indigenous knowledge that Indigenous people can bring to the issues that we're trying to face. I've learned that Western science is important, but it doesn't have all the answers. So part of our action on climate in British Columbia is through our climate change and economic strategy called Clean BC. I hope most of you have heard of it, and if you don't, it's probably because I'm not getting out enough to talk about it. But we developed climate targets. We developed a plan to meet them. We're still refining it and working on it. We've called it Clean BC, and Clean BC includes climate preparedness and adaptation strategy. We know that we just have to, every summer, look at wildfires, look at droughts in some areas, floods in others, or look at the impacts on low-lying ocean nations, the impacts on Indigenous people around the world, to see that we're having an escalating impact globally of the climate change that's already happened, and we need to commit ourselves to do everything we can to reduce emissions and keep things from getting worse. But it's also true that we're going to be adapting to climate change, barring some significant technological miracle. We've already changed the temperature of the planet and our climate, and we're seeing the impacts, and we will for years to come. So we have been for some time developing a climate preparedness and adaptation strategy, which I expect to release later this spring. It began with a climate risk assessment, which was posted on my ministry's website. You're all adept at Googling, you'll find it. We developed it with extensive collaboration and outreach, both inside and outside government. We worked across ministries for instance, with Emergency Management BC, with Forest Lands and Natural Resources, with every ministry that had some knowledge about the impacts we're feeling and the impacts they would expect to feel. So we tried to build that into our planning and assessment. We also consulted with business, academics, and local and regional governments. But the other, I would say, far more critical engagement we did was trying to find the right mechanisms and fora for working with Indigenous people to ensure we aligned with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act that we passed over a year ago. And I would say that we're continuing to learn how to do that well and how to do that appropriately. I think we've done a fair amount of it in developing the climate preparedness and adaptation strategy. I'm hopeful that the Indigenous nations and organizations with whom we consulted will feel the same thing, but I know that we will always be looking to do better. So among the things that we'll talk about doing is increase and add to our investments to reduce the risk of fire and floods, to help prepare our agriculture and food systems, to support data and monitoring, to ensure that that as we rebuild our forests through reforestation, that we're taking into account the impacts of climate that we're seeing. So let me take a minute to just review some of the guiding principles we use to develop the strategy and for our work going forward. The first one, as I mentioned, was building a shared path to climate resilience with Indigenous peoples. Indigenous knowledge, as I've said, is critical to this, and the connection and awareness of what is happening to our land, to our water, and the changes that we've seen that people in Indigenous communities talk to us about really helps focus both the need to have a good plan and some of the things we have to do. We've seen declines in traditional food sources like salmon, berries, moose. So we used regional and digital outreach. We obviously had to find new ways with COVID. We have an Indigenous climate adaptation technical working group. We don't have it, it's established, but we certainly connected with it, and we've collaborated with the First Nations Leadership Council. We also have begun some immediate initiatives like working with Indigenous nations to move to support more resilient forms of clean renewable energy and to replace reliance on diesel. Great examples like Kanakabar Indian Band, who are building resilient energy, housing, and food systems that are interlinked to withstand future climate changes and have renewable energy projects. There are others who are doing the same. So we want to continue to focus our relationships with Indigenous people as we roll out the strategy in the years to come. We also agreed that we need an equity-informed approach. We have to enhance climate resilience for everyone, no matter where in the province people live, and no matter what their economic station. It affects everyone equally, although actually it doesn't. I would say that it affects the well-off in privileged positions in society least, because people have more options and more resources to take some of the measures that are available, but it does affect everyone. So we want to ensure we enhance health and well-being for everyone, and we want to also promote nature-based solutions that both enhance community resilience and ecosystem resilience. So as part of our economic recovery plan to COVID, for example, which is called Stronger BC, we're investing to conserve wetlands and ecosystems. We've created 1,000 jobs to build some nature-based climate solutions. We've worked with Watersheds BC, the POLIS project on ecological governance at the University of Victoria, as well as the Real Estate Foundation, which has a long history of funding projects. Many of these projects involve partnerships with Indigenous communities and will increase our natural carbon. The climate preparedness strategy will also work to align our actions on adaptation with our actions to reduce emissions. The two need to go hand in hand. And finally, the last principle, although there may well be more that we discover in the years to come, is we want to ensure that we show people who invest in BC, people in small communities who start businesses, as well as the industries that employ many British Columbians, that there is a business case for adaptation as there's a business case for emissions mitigation, that it's necessary, it's the smart thing to do, and we're seeing around the world increasingly investors are asking the question, if you can't show us your plan to get to net zero, don't ask us to invest in you. Early action is important to build an innovative and resilient economy. So thank you thank you for the conference. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for what you're going to do. There's going to be many, many, many years of people working together in BC, and I think all of you who are attending today will be part of that. I'm sure you're going to hear some inspiring thoughts in the hours to come. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Heyman, for those remarks. The provincial government is such a critical partner in our community's journeys towards adaptation. And given the urgency of the climate crisis, it's important that we're all aligned on our vision for the future and that we're working towards the same goals. So thank you for sharing more about your government's progress, for confirming that you understand the unique challenges faced by small and Indigenous communities, and for challenging us all to be better at working together and understanding each other so that we can collectively ensure a resilient future for BC. For those of you I haven't met yet at this conference, my name is Rethoret. I am the coordinator of the Columbia Basin Rural Development Institute at Selkirk College, and I'm very excited about our next session, which is on bridging and reconciling silos between traditional ecological knowledge and climate adaptation. And it's absolutely my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jeannette Armstrong. Jeannette is Selkirk Okanagan, a fluent speaker of the language and a traditional knowledge keeper of plant medicines, Selkirk traditions, and cultural protocols. And as the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Okanagan philosophy, she is also the director of the Okanagan Centre, an Indigenous cultural, educational, ecological, and creative arts institution operated by and for members of the Okanagan Nation. She's also an author in her own right, in that she has published poetry, novels, and children's titles. So thanks for agreeing to be with us today, Jeannette, and over to you.
Okay. Good morning, and I'm just going to say a few words in my language for everyone to appreciate. So I'm just giving greetings in my language and giving acknowledgement back in your acknowledgement for the lands that many of us are situated on right now, and also want to starting just say thank you to the conveners for this dialogue. I think it's really an important aspect to think about, and I'm going to be talking more about it, but I want to thank in particular Lauren Rethoret and Ingrid Leipa and Jayme for helping me through all this technology get here to be with you today. I also want to acknowledge the words of the Honorable George Heyman, Minister of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, and some of the thoughts that he shared about the work that needs to be done, and some of it is already indeed started with Indigenous peoples here in this province. In light of the way that we want to move forward, I really want to focus my talk this morning on how the bridging and reconciling of silos between traditional knowledge and the idea of climate adaptation with small communities and rural communities could be thought about. And so I'm not going to go into a number of other areas, but I think it's really important to preface the first part of my talk to give you some background and underpinning about my context around traditional ecological knowledge and what I mean in relation to that from my Selkirk Okanagan perspective. I don't pretend to speak for Indigenous peoples across the country or anywhere. I can only talk from what I actually have studied all my life and know about in the best way that I can explain it in relation to this topic here. So I'm part of the Okanagan Selkirk Nation, that was in large part removed from some areas in the Selkirk, either to the other side of the international boundary where a lot of my relatives live in the Colville Indian Reservation, the Colville Confederated Tribes across there. My mother was from down there and on the Kettle River. And she was born at Kettle Falls, actually. And my father on this side of the border in the British Columbia part of the Okanagan Nation. But my lineage, my kinship lineage is actually from the Arrow Lakes area, where my great grandfather was one of the chiefs. And his nephew, his descendant nephew, was the chief salmon organizer and manager at the Great Kettle Falls. He was the last hereditary chief organizer there. And he was my great grand uncle, Chief Kankanahua. And so a lot of the work that I do is really as a responsibility and role with my family to maintain and our knowledge systems there in the areas that surround Arrow Lakes. I've been there all my life, every year with my brothers hunting or with my mother and aunties and grandmas, picking berries, huckleberries mostly, and medicines as well, because, you know, as been mentioned, I'm a knowledge keeper in my community of our plant medicines, which has also led me to participate in terms of the Western academic system in science and really try to find ways in which we could bridge to do things in a better way in our own communities and move outward to work in better ways, particularly for the revitalization of our knowledge systems, the revitalization of how we can use them in today's world in terms of managing and taking care of our lands and our people. So that's a big part of the work that I do at an Elkin Center and at UBC. And at UBC, of course, there's a lot of work in terms of the Canada Council research that I do. The work that I do is to try to bring the nation to some of the science work that is going on there that they could collaborate on. And, you know, in conservation or in planning or in research that will underpin many of those areas. So in this talk, I really want to focus on the idea of how lands themselves are an opportunity for small communities and people that live on those lands to work with Indigenous peoples. And because I'm going to be speaking about traditional ecological knowledge, the whole idea I'm going to be focused in terms of the climate adaptation will be in the area of resilience related to the whole area of mobilizing communities to work together to restore lands and conservation of lands and work together in terms of how to work with Indigenous peoples in tech. So that's where I'm going to be focusing my talk. But I would like to contribute to this idea in a good way in terms of bridging and reconciling these silos, because there really is a deep division that we can't seem to be able to cross that bridge very well without a lot of conflict, without a lot of misunderstanding, and without a lot of struggle. And we're all aware of that. So first of all, I would like to just give you a thumbnail sketch of what I understand about TEK, Traditional Ecological Knowledge. And I'm just going to be using that acronym from my own Syilx perspective. So one of the definitions that I think about in terms of seal traditional ecological knowledge is that it's the learning that we underwent to be on these lands, and for me to be standing here talking to you. You know, the millennia, that decades of learning that my people have had to go through to be able to thrive in these areas and to build up their civilization in ways that respected the land, and in ways that in which their ethic and their values about the land, their connection and their relationships to the land is so strong that it still survives today, that it's there burning inside of me and my brothers and sisters and cousins and my relatives in the Shuswap and in the Tanaha, and you know, and of course the work that we're all involved in to try to bring that forward in the reconciliation process, because reconciliation isn't just one direction. We have to also reconcile with how we might work in the bridging and in the bringing of other ideas into the way we think and the way we do things. And so that's really the tension, I think, that confounds all of us in that work. But tech is foundational to, I'm going to just have a sip here, is foundational to the seal societal ethic. And that's where I want to start from. And you know, for those of you that are interested, you can read my dissertation, which goes more into depth about that. I'm just going to turn my phone off here. So I guess from my point of view, that idea of tech being specific knowledge, TEK being specific knowledge located in a specific place, is a knowledge of the land and the waters based in how that whole system operates in that specific place. So it's not broad and spreading, you know, all across the country. Tech really relates to the places that we occupy. And every community of the Okanagan Nation has its own specific areas that they occupied and used. And so even if I'm from Penticton, I don't have the same tech with people up in the North Okanagan in Vernon. I have some, you know, common understanding, common grounding, but if I really want to know what's going on there, I go to the people that are out there on the land and have knowledge about that land that they've occupied. Their families have been there generations and know that land intimately and know all of the ways in which it operates. So the idea that the natural environment that we live in, I think one of the fundamental ideas about tech is that it's not viewed as land in terms of things out there. It's viewed as a process. And that is a process of interrelationships between the many life forms within that place, which is expressed in the patterns of the continuous cycles of change. The change that's delineated by topography, terrain, drainage, wind, and rain patterns, as well as larger climatic cycles over time. So knowledge of these patterns and the cycles that underpin traditional knowledge is what I'm thinking about and what I'm relying on and talking about when I use the word tech. But also foundational to the Selkirk knowledge is the way our language constructed meaning. In other words, the knowledge comes from how the land informed us. And so the language itself contains that knowledge and those meanings that relate directly to the land, because that's how we survived, that's how we lived. We had to know everything about the land, and we had to be able to construct words for it and meanings for it. So language is incredibly important in terms of that knowledge of the land and its processes. So it's sustained our people here for 10,000 years at the very least or more. You know, there's different ways of thinking about where our people came from, and how they might have moved either from, you know, the land bridge. But in our stories, it's very clear. Our historical stories say that we moved northward from the south as the ice receded. And so our language reveals knowledge that our interactions with each other as humans matter the most in terms of our interrelationships with the land. Because if we can't get along, if we can't work together, then we're fighting each other, we're competing with each other, we're pushing each other out, and we're becoming selfish in terms of excluding others, and then poverty happens. So that idea of how we interrelate, how we care for each other is foundational to the Selkirk idea, and all the interior Salishan groups concur with that in terms of the way that we all evolved over, you know, the 12,000 years into 25 separate Salishan groups, of which the Shuswap and the Sinixt and the Selkirk Okanagan are all part of, and all the Salishan groups from here to the coast and from here to Montana. So, but I want to provide one small example, just one kind of little tidbit in terms of language and knowledge embedded in the language. So the idea of our land is contained in the word Tamhula. And so you can hear that first part of the word, and I'm a fluent speaker. It's a mother tongue. I've spoken it all my life. And so what I see are active images in the moving parts of our language, because our language has been described as a polysynthetic language. What that means is that various parts that form images on the land and about people, active images, can be moved around in different ways to create meaning. It's a little bit different than words, which are static in English. It's a different way of seeing language and meaning in the language. But that idea of the word Tamhula incorporates, first of all, a foundational idea about Tamih and what Tamih is. And my whole dissertation is a breakdown of what that word actually means. So I won't go into that, but that idea, just a foundational image concept, is if there was one source and many, many strands spreading outward for it, continue from that source, emerging and spreading outward from that source, that's the visual image of Mih. My hair, for instance, here, we can take that word Mih, and I can say Kmihkan, all the strands of my hair are spreading outward. When it's braided, it's not the same word, because my hair isn't spreading outward from my head. So that image of Mih means all of the various life forms that keep emerging continuously, year after year, season after season, decade after decade here in this place. So it's a beautiful idea of that continuous regeneration. And the second part of that word, ul, Tamih ul, right, Tamhula, that second part of that word gives you an image of things that are moving in continuous cycles or spirals. We can, for instance, our word for the fire drill, in which we, use continuous circular motion, is called hul. You can hear that ul in there. And many of the different ways in which those cycles would be expressed, that sound will be in there. So Tamhula, you can hear that sound of the many things spreading outward in spirals, in cycles. And la means right here, right now. It's a reference to this place in this now. not in the past, not in the future, but right now. So when you're looking at the land, you're looking at the idea of, in your mind, the imagery of all the living things that are emerging from that one source and spreading outward. And at the center of that idea is it's going to be continuing and following the cycles and the seasons. And so the knowledge that you have about the cycles of birth and death and growth and regeneration and all of those things are tied to that one word. And so immense amount of knowledge and science in that word, in terms of how we think about traditional ecological knowledge. Yet that word is translated as land, which doesn't even come close to that idea when we're looking at things that are out there, that they're out there. Yes, they're out there and they're part of that idea, but we can actually see the signs in what's happening when we use the word Timhula. So we see in that word that the same place in winter, in summer, in spring, in fall is a different place in terms of the processes that are going on at that time in those places. The species are different. What they're doing is different. and their interactions are different, and our interactions are different. So it's never the same place at any time. So that's really an important aspect to the way we think about knowledge. We need to know what they're doing at what time of the year and where, and why they're, doing that in order to be able to procure and interrelate with them in the way that our people did. And so the knowledge of those cycles allows us to understand how it works for all the species in those places, because of the interrelationships that are required for you to know, so that you're not, depleting or damaging, because you're dependent on the idea of 100% regeneration. You have to know in order for it to regenerate. But it also means you have to know how to get along with your neighbors so that you're not depleting it by fighting over it, by excluding each other, by creating hostilities and aggressions that end up to do damage. And so our Salish peoples had a huge concord of interrelating and working together. We used these gatherings that in our language has meaning to make peace and to cement relationships and to create physical kinship relationships across those boundaries of different language and different culture. And so many of the ethnographers and historians that I study provide solid evidence that that was continuously going on and is still going on, except for the interference of some really negative processes, in terms of, like, for instance, the treaty process, suggesting that there weren't overlapping or there weren't joint use concords and agreements and constructive arrangements between our peoples. And, those kinds of issues are interfering with our ability to continue that vast concord of relating in a good way within each other's ideas of how we did that in the past. So, but the outcome of that knowledge instituted good societal practices that have relevance in this dialogue with each other as small communities and rural communities and our settler communities in terms of all the people who have lived here for a number of generations and how we're trying to manage and work things together. We know that not to have that knowledge in terms of how we need to get along together and work together allows practices that displace, dispossess, and destroy the places that all of us occupy. In other words, not having that knowledge allows for the unsustainable practices that end up in the climate change disaster that we're in. So to us as Syilx, being human and being part of this land means that we have a unique responsibility to bridge silos with people that are here with us, to make way for us being able to collaborate and work together, and to gain that knowledge collectively, to use our best tools collectively. And that's what Anauken means. That's the actual word Anauken. I spend a lot of time at the university talking about how that process, as a dialogue process, helps bring people together and helps build healthy relationships. So, but I want to go to some other ideas that can help with that. The United Nations Declaration that was referenced by the minister on the rights of Indigenous people clearly does point to Indigenous rights to land and resources. And in that way, it can provide a framework within which conversations like this can take place in relation to reconciliation. And some of that is already starting. As well, the Convention on Biodiversity, in its Article 8J, outlines what in situ conservation might mean in terms of conservation and biodiversity. And it calls for nation states, and I'm going to read from Article 8J here, just a few lines. It calls for nation states to respect, preserve, and maintain knowledge, innovations, and practices of Indigenous and local communities embodying traditional lifestyles relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and promote their wider application with the approval and involvement of the holders of such knowledge, the innovations and practices, and encourage the equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the utilization of those knowledges, innovations, and practices. So you can see it fits right directly in that area that we're having this dialogue about in terms of finding new ways to do things. So conservation, conversations about biodiversity on Indigenous managed lands have a deep relevance in this conversation in terms of how climate adaptation through mitigation actions can implement a reconciliatory process. Here we can also explore the potential for Indigenous managed lands to contribute not just to the local, but positively to national and global goals for terrestrial biodiversity conservation. An analysis of the global extent of Indigenous managed lands and biodiversity published in an article by Garnett et al. In 2018 in Nature Sustainability provides us with a clear view that Indigenous land management practices are shown definitively to result in higher native rare species in terms of their richness. Their study, titled A Spatial Overview of the Global Importance of Indigenous Lands for Conservation, provided geospatial analysis indicating that collaborative partnerships involving conservation practitioners, Indigenous peoples, and governments yield significant benefits for the conservation of ecological valuable landscapes, ecosystems, and species. Moreover, their findings globally show that lands that Indigenous peoples currently manage or have tenure to are roughly a quarter of Earth's land surface area. That's significant. It asserts that collaborating with Indigenous nations and organizations in a larger way and enhancing Indigenous land management practices clearly represents a route to achieving global targets for biodiversity conservation, while at the same time advancing Indigenous rights to land, sustainable resource use, and human well-being in those areas. I also want to point to an excellent study by Schuster et al., published in November 2019 in an issue of Environmental Science and Policy, which examined vertebrate biodiversity on Indigenous managed lands in Australia, Brazil, and Canada. Those were the 3 countries. That study provided clear evidence that Indigenous managed lands were more vertebrate species rich than existing protected areas in those 3 countries. All the data, all the science you want to examine in that study tells you that Indigenous managed lands were more vertebrate rich. Why? What's the difference, right? Those questions arise immediately. It found, for example, in Brazil and Canada, in the lands that were studied, that, and there was like all across Canada, there were all these random selected areas as well as protected areas and different Indigenous managed lands, that Indigenous managed lands supported more threatened vertebrate species than in any existing protected areas or in other randomly selected non-protected areas in the wild, right? The study concluded that partnerships with Indigenous communities that maintain or enhance Indigenous land tenure and their practices on Indigenous managed lands created the potential to ameliorate national and global shortfalls in land protection for biodiversity conservation as a mix of conventional protected areas and Indigenous managed lands. Now, those are science studies. Those are studies with hard data. Those are not just conjectures that tech works and Indigenous managed, led lands in terms of that work is important for us to think about here. But there are also many good examples of that work already happening globally. And I want to just briefly point to 2 of them that are ones that I think provide ways in which we can rethink the way that we're doing things, both from the government level, the municipal level, and the Indigenous First Nations level, and other Indigenous groups that may be in that area. I think of the potato park, for instance, in the Andes, for example, in the Peruvian Andes, the Parque de la Papa, or the potato park, which is a sprawling 9,200 hectare agro-ecological region. There were 6 local Quechua communities that set up a communal governance system back in 2002 to preserve native potato varieties, because that's the birthplace of all potatoes in the world, to protect them both from biopiracy by multinational biotech and agricultural corporations, but more importantly, to conserve their traditional culture, their traditional knowledge, and their traditional livelihoods. In other words, to continue to live the way they wanted to live. So this Cusco nonprofit association in the Andes, and I've visited there a number of times with my friend who leads that work in that area, Alejandro Agamedo. I met him during my work on the Cultural Survival Canada back in a decade or 2 ago. But he leads that work in that area. The park is now home to some 7,000 people who work together to develop medicinal plants. They participate in weaving and cuisine cooperatives. They boost tourism and bring economy to the area as a result of what they're doing there. And they contribute to cutting edge potato research. Some of that research in terms of the varieties of potatoes and their sustainability and all of those areas with science researchers is just amazing and unimaginable. And they declared themselves as potato gardens, and because they not only incorporate their own practices and protect those practices in terms of their traditional spiritual values, but they incorporate those practices into all the operations from the government level downward into what they're doing with that park. Here in Canada, there's another good example that's been in the works since about 2014. And it's kind of an offshoot of the Yellowknife to Yellowstone initiative that Dr. Harvey Locke is engaged in setting targets for Canada. Here in Canada, the historic Buffalo Treaty that was initiated by Professor Emerite Dr. Leroy Littlebear from the University of Lethbridge initiated and created that historic agreement that formalizes intertribal collaborations to restore the bison to tribal and to appropriate non-tribal public lands. And one of the most exciting collaborations that's happening for the tribal groups, both, and the First Nation groups in Alberta and the tribal groups in Montana. And so working together with parks, for instance, allowed the restoration of bison to, the Banff and a number of other areas that they're being restored to in the US in major parks, and to the First Nations that are all part of this Buffalo Treaty. And their work in those, building those bridges, building those collaborations were Indigenous led in terms of how the ceremonies and how the protocols work and how, how the decision making is made. So if we wish to bridge the silos between small urban communities and Indigenous communities in the work of adaptation, and in this case, we're talking about mitigation in terms of the lands that we're all surrounded by, we must be willing to include all the tools available to us, all the things that are happening elsewhere can help inform us, can help us to think about how we can, in our areas, change. But I think one of the unique challenges that we have here in the southern parts of British Columbia and in the small urban and small municipalities is that the areas that we're sometimes thinking about may be as simple as the work that we're doing here in the Okanagan Center to try to protect the last cottonwood riparian stand, which hosts a whole number of endangered species here on the Penticton Indian Reserve, and working with the city and the regional district of the Okanagan-Smilkameen to try to find ways in which we can continue that work and to work with the federal government through the Aboriginal Funds for Species at Risk to develop a collaborative process, not only to restore the cottonwoods, but to restore, who the cottonwoods feed in the river and on the land itself. And so that kind of collaboration, leads to things happening. For instance, the sockeye and the Chinook salmon are finally making it home after 52 years of not being able to reach my community and our people not being able to harvest salmon. Now we're able to celebrate and harvest salmon because of that collaborative work, because of that willingness to work together with sometimes who we think of as enemies, right, across the table. And I think that's really an important thing in terms of mobilizing silos, because tech isn't just about how to, use ideas and turn it into the hard science that's there and working well, but to look at how science itself might be mitigated in terms of its expansion into different ways of knowing and different ways of applying the underlying principles that tech contains. And so we need to find the courage to do the things differently, since doing the same things will only produce the same results. We need to find new things to do, new ways to do those things. Hope inspires change, but it is action that makes changes happen. So inspirations for actions that are building solutions will require the creation of opportunities that governments are responsible for making happen. So there's a deep reliance on how much understanding we can provide and contribute to the government's ears so that their tools can go into place. That's vastly needed, I think. And actions to mitigate old systemic prejudices for change needs to happen at the same time. Otherwise, the silos stay in place for all the same reasons. So I'll leave you with these questions that I have. And I think the host will also provide those questions for you. What is the truth? And I'm relating it to the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. What is the truth that keeps these silos in place? Are you courageous enough to talk about it, to look inward, to find your truth in that path? The second question is, how can governments be more effective in furthering the reconciliation process? Government is the people. You, all of you listening, are the government. So how can we give our leaders in government our understanding of how things need to change? Right? That process in reconciliation and the mitigation actions that involve Indigenous managing seems to be a difficult impasse. And so we need governments to listen and to help us work through those areas and to provide opportunities for collaborations, real collaborations. And yeah, there'll be some mistakes made, but that's how we learn. That's how we figure out how to do things. So the last thing I want to leave with you is the bigger question that from the Indigenous point of view is an important question. What does reconciliation mean in these unceded lands here in British Columbia, beyond the words acknowledging that they are unceded lands? So what does reconciliation mean there in the context of this dialogue? I want to wish you the very best discussions in your breakout sessions, and I really look forward to the outcomes from these sorts of dialogues, and I really want to thank everyone for their participation and their thinking. And I look forward to the outcomes in this, my ancestors' traditional territory. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jeannette. And so the questions have been posted in the chat, and we are going to take the next 15 minutes to go out into breakout rooms of 4 or 5. So yeah. I'm hoping that everyone had some, really good discussions. And I think one of the things that happens in these dialogues is that, just having that conversation, having that opportunity to think together in smaller groups, I think is really an incredibly important way to bring people together, to bring communities together. And I look forward to the time when we can do that with the Indigenous communities and all of you participating, in that particular way. So have a nice rest of the conference. I have other obligations and wish you the best. And thank you for inviting me to speak. It's a wonderful opportunity.
Thank you so much, Jeannette, for taking the time to spend with us this morning. I was sensing in the crowd that there's a desire to dig in a bit deeper with you and ask a few questions. And it's unfortunate that we don't have time for that today, but I will invite people to follow up with Jeannette individually if there's something you want to dig into a little bit deeper. Yeah, there was lots that we talked about in our breakout rooms. It was quite inspiring for us. And I really appreciate how you brought to us some clear examples of how people are already bridging that gap, right, between traditional ecological knowledge and Western science. And I think that's a great foundation for all of us to build our future work on. So thank you, Jeannette. Best of luck for the rest of your day. And for the rest of us, we are now moving into a 15-minute break. Get up, stretch, go outside. It's not raining here yet, but it will be later. And then we're going to reconvene at 10:30. So in 13 minutes, we're going to reconvene back on FeedLib in the concurrent sessions. Take a look at the program, choose which ones you want to join, and I will see you there. Thanks, everyone.